the Spiderverse team had a monumental task ahead of them to create an emotional story around a relatively unknown character in a unique style that didn't exist, and with around half the budget of a typical Disney animated film. But this passion project that saw the largest animation team ever assembled of over 1,000 artists would soon challenge and change the way animated films were expected to look like. In 2014, Sony began developing its next animated movie based on the comic book of the same name. But in a world where Spider-Man stories are abundant and perhaps growing stale, the animators were faced with innovating a brand new animation style along with all the necessary tools that told an emotional story that conversely broke the mold for what animated films are now expected to look like, all for a lesser known character that in the end was still expected to go largely unnoticed. Coming up with the style and fitting it to a compelling story was a complex task for the film's producers and artists, as the creators wanted to tell a story from the perspective of what it would be like to live inside a moving comic book in an industry where photorealism, making an animated film seem closer to real life, has become the norm. Instead, the creators imagined a movie that stood out on its own, with a visual style that had never been attempted before, introducing viewers to a new Spider-Man while attempting to recreate the visual styles of the traditional comic books that they remember reading as kids. As far back as Spider-Man's earliest days, Spider-Man has a rich history of experimentation in his artwork, with artists boldly drawing wild, vibrant colors. The team knew that a cartoon unbound from the tiresome constraints of our realism could stand as the project to finally fully illustrate what moving art, unbound to any norms, could achieve. But this made for a difficult challenge, with coming up with how the characters would move around in these strange comic worlds. The major visual challenge was how every character was going to look. The team didn't want to emulate reality or have it look like a cartoon. They instead had to come up with their own animation language that could be used for different animation styles, as each character had to have their own distinct art and animation style coming from their own dimension, while still having them move like Spider-Man. Characters like Spider-Punk eventually had such a bold design that he's basically a living punk rock poster, that even when he's standing still, he looks like he's constantly in motion compared to the rest. Then there was the challenge of the dimensions themselves, where each dimension the characters visit was meant to precisely emulate the original style of that character's comic book origin. To make the movie even more immersive, the animators decided they needed the audience to feel like they were walking into something akin to a living painting, each painted by a different artist, when in reality they had hundreds of different animators touching upon the scenes, each in their own way, with many taking a week to work on 1 to 2 seconds of a scene that, in the end, all had to fit together as if it was created by a single person. Beyond wanting to emulate the work of famous comic book artists that had come before, the team aimed for authenticity regarding cultural nuance. Miles' New York and eventually the many different Spider-Man's worlds needed to feel like a place the audience could inhabit that actually existed, each with their own histories and deeply rooted cultures. This saw the team quickly running into problems when it came to places like the Indian Spider-Man Pavitra's home of Mumbattan, whose scenes felt clunky and quite off. That soon had the animators reaching out to various cultural groups for help to fix their scenes. Then, to top off the creation process, perhaps comes my favorite part, where the team had to figure out how to translate Spider-Man's acrobatic movements into many new styles to suit each character, as they got to business animating them doing some really cool tricks. And as someone who enjoys doing cool tricks, this movie's pretty awesome. To solve their many problems, the first film, Into the Spider-Verse, began with a total of 177 animators on staff, which was 6.5 times higher than the staff that works on a typical Disney film, like for instance Toy Story 3, which had only 27 animators. The second film Across the Spider-Verse onward, however, has over 1,000 animators on staff to make the film's many distinct worlds and hundreds of characters work, while still having half half of the typical Disney animated film budget, with titles like The Incredibles 2, Toy Story 3 and 4, and Cars costing $200 million to make, while Tangled and The Lion King ran around $260 million each, while the Spiderverse movies cost about $100 million each. The first thing the animators did to bring their unique vision to life was to cut out all motion blur, being a technique that makes the characters and objects look like they're moving much more smoothly by blurring their movements, such as when a car drives by or when Spider-Man is swinging across the city, making the movement look more realistic. But going against this realistic look that has dominated modern animations, instead the animators came up with a series of ingenious ideas to make the worlds look like a living comic book. The movies are grounded with an innovation the team calls stepped animation, meaning that the animation doesn't change every frame like you would expect from a typical animated movie. Instead, characters and people moving around the city will be moving and then suddenly stop for 1 frame, or 2 frames, or sometimes 3 frames, before they begin moving again, making their motion look rather jittery. The team experimented for over a year on finding the right spirit for the film, and since any traditional rendering technique they tried just didn't work, eventually, the animators opted for a really old-school technique called smear that a lot of early cartoons like 1942's Dover Boys at Pimento University used to depict one quick blur of motion. So if you look really closely at scenes like when Gwen Stacy is playing the drums and pause it, you can see that she has multiple limbs and drumsticks to create the illusion of movement. Specifically, this old-school jitteriness gave the film's look a new crispness and sharpness that was unattainable through the traditional standards animators had come to rely on, as Miles and characters move at a shuddering, uneven pace in a world that the audience feels like they could be a part of. Despite growing initial concerns, the animators wanted to give the film an even more unique look than they had currently achieved, so they looked at comics, illustrations, and 2D animation for inspiration, before borrowing an old 2D animation trick that finally gave them the feel they had been searching for. By animating some objects and characters on 2s, or every other frame instead of 1s, being every frame, characters felt snappier and had comic-like poses. So while some characters and object had a different drawn movement for every frame of the 24 frames in a second, other characters moving alongside them only move on every second frame, and sometimes less than that, making their poses last much longer and movements much more pronounced to the audience. In cases such as when Miles is scared, learning how to swing, or just running for his life, at moments he is out of sync with the other more experienced Spider-Man, being animated on 2s, giving him an inexperienced and clumsy feel. But these so-called in-between-the-gap animations, or 2s, broke another industry standard. The team, however, came up with a saying that was, "If it ain't broke, break it," and used errors and imperfections in their work as a springboard rather than a point of frustration, soon coming up with not only another new patented software, but came up with the idea to replace certain frames with hand-drawn animations, along with every single effect in the movie to make them look more like comic book illustrations. But one of the most interesting techniques the animation team came up with is their misprint error style. You see, back when you would look at a comic book, you could notice an error where the ink and wording was accidentally misprinted in a weird doubled way, which not only makes the comic book way more valuable, but gave the filmmakers the idea to add misprints of their own to simulate a strange feel of depth and blur to the film instead of simply blurring objects in the background like other films. Another happy experiment that blew the studio away is when it comes to the color used in the films. The studio noticed that comic books often have additional misprints when it comes to their colors, causing things like blues and pinks to be rather offset. Upon tinkering with that look, the team accidentally gave a sort of mid-century cardboard 3D glass look that just made the film pop off the screen to their surprise. Then there's the reason why the filmmakers really needed to hire such a large team of 1,000 people for the second film onwards, being how they tackled the massive visual challenge of animating the multitude of 240 Spider-Man variants across 6 unique dimensions. Each character was meticulously meticulously researched and designed with their own animation and movement style, as characters like Penny Parker from the first film was a CG 2D hybrid manga character that had to move like she was from an anime, while Spider-Ham was completely hand-drawn, complete with cartoonish movements that stand out against the other characters, as the team ultimately drew every single character as a series of two-dimensional shapes instead of creating puppets that they could freely animate like many other films do to save time. The team then created and taught a program to draw the distinct ink lines that are responsible for all the characters' facial expressions and overall mood, with machine learning being trained to eventually automate that process for the lines around things like the character's hands and neck. Additional characters like Spider-Cat, T-Rex Spider-Man, and Scarlet Spider-Man all are drawn with their own unique textures and line styles, with the team developing hundreds of new brushes and new tools, giving them the ability to do amazing things like making characters seem like they're being painted in real time as the audience watches the film, while dripping paint across the screen behind the characters as they move, and dynamically changing the colors around them depending on how fast they are moving. The film had so much going into it that at times it took 1 week to animate just 1 second of footage. Conversely, for most animated films, it usually takes 1 week for 4 seconds, but for the Spider-Verse crew, it actually took them 1 year to just get 10 seconds they were happy with before deciding to move on with the rest of the film, with a total shot count of the Spider-Verse films being 2 to 3 times higher than other animated films. This whole process required so much innovation and throwing away of what worked in the past just to obtain seconds of the film, also that they could give an audience something they had never seen before on screen and unique enough that we couldn't tell how it was made. If it ain't broke, break it, because when you put thought and effort into something, you'll undoubtedly discover something new and cool. But if none of this was very interesting,
prove it that you're Spider-Man.
then I saved an interesting fact for last. Throughout the film, distinct visual colors and tones are used to indicate exactly what a character is feeling, with things like Tron, Blade Runner, Akira, and even Leonardo da Vinci's drawings were used as a direct inspiration for many of the movie's designs. Consider watching one of these videos to see more hidden stories behind your favorite films.